welcome to another episode of the Iraqi Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Juma Iraqi. And before I introduce today's guest, I just want to mention that this podcast is available on YouTube, but you can also find it on Stitcher, SoundCloud, and iTunes as well. Today's guest is, by popular demand, the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Eric Helms. Eric, great to have you back on the podcast. I think this is the third time you're on the Iraqi Nutrition Podcast. How are you doing today?
Well, first, I just want to thank my mother and my father. It's an honor to be here, and I couldn't have done it without my team. So thank you for this honor of being the three-time inaugural guest of the Juma Iraqi podcast. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. So great to have you back, man. It's been a while since you were here the last time, and I think this will be a really interesting episode for a lot of our listeners. But for people that might not know you, I don't know who wouldn't know who Eric Helms is, but there might be some people out there. So could you give us an introduction about yourself?
Absolutely. So I am a research fellow at the Sports Performance Research Institute, New Zealand. And in addition to being an academic who works with master's students and PhD students and conducts research, I'm also a coach at 3D Muscle Journey and the chief science advisor for 3D Muscle Journey, where we work with drug-free strength athletes and bodybuilders and promote evidence-based information. I'm also an author and a reviewer, along with Mike Zerdos and Greg Knuckles, for MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, where we review the most current research relevant to strength and physique athletes every month. So basically, I kind of fashion myself a science communicator for the drug-free strength community and do the best I can to serve that community. And I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. And I think you're doing a great job. Like, one of the most frequent books I recommend to students is the Training and Nutrition Pyramid books that you've written.
Thank you.
Is there a second edition that's coming to that? I know you update it frequently.
We did a bunch of updates shortly after it came out because, you can do a lot of peer-to-peer reading, but then when you see what people are confused by, what they don't understand, or what things they felt are missing or lacking, that's when you do a bunch of edits. So those all went out to people, like a year ago now. But we haven't touched it much since then. And working on the second edition, and we hope to get that out by near the end of this year. So I'm excited about that.
Excellent. All right, Eric, let's dive into the question. Today's topic is training volume and intensity. So to get the listeners a better understanding of what we're talking about, could you please describe to us what we mean by training volume and intensity?
For sure. So volume, kind of in a big picture definition, is talking about the total amount of work you're doing. And depending on the type of exercise, it can be counted different ways. And I think more recently, which is probably what your listeners are interested in thinking about, is that for different goals, you might count volume differently. And I'll define what I mean by that in a moment. So that's volume. It's basically how much of a thing you're doing. Intensity is essentially the directionality. It's the type of adaptation you're trying to get will dictate the intensity you will select. And this is a more confusing term for a lot of people, especially in the lifting community, because it has a colloquial meaning as well. How hard you are working, are you doing a lot of drop sets, basically just what's the kind of the difficulty of the session or the exercise or the set. So when people say intensity in colloquial speech, and when they read about it or they hear about it, it can mean two or even three different things. In the context of resistance training, I think the two most important ways to measure intensity are intensity of load and intensity of effort. So intensity of load would be related to, most commonly, your 1RM. It could be related to a 5RM as well. So you might say 80% of 1 by 1 rep max, for example, and that's an objective definition of intensity of load. Intensity of effort, however, is an independent, however, somewhat interrelated concept of basically how hard was a given set. And in resistance training, arguably the most useful metric for this is the RPE scale based on repetitions in reserve, which is something that Dr. Zerdos has gotten into the literature based on some of Mike T's work. Mike T is a powerlifter who pioneered this concept of gauging how far you are from failure to assess the difficulty of a given set, and also to auto-regulate training. But that's another discussion. So essentially, they're independent concepts because you can do a single repetition at 80% of 1RM, or you could take that set all the way to failure, and most people that would be somewhere around a 8 to 10 RM. So if you were to do eight reps out of an 8 RM, that would be a 10 RPE, meaning you couldn't do any more reps, or 0 repetitions in reserve. If you did a single rep, you would be 7 repetitions in reserve, or well far from failure. The velocity would be faster, you wouldn't be nearly as fatigued, and you would think that 8 sets of 1 at 80% and 1 set of 8 at 80% would produce somewhat different adaptations. So that's kind of volume and load. The way to think about them is that one is dictating the amount of the other, so they're interrelated concepts. So when people might say something like, hey, progressive tension overload is what drives muscular adaptations and drives hypertrophy, I say yes, and then volume is how much of that tension you're supplying.
Excellent explanation. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word training intensity, they imagine Dorian Yates in the dungeon screaming while he's performing his sets to failure, and his training partner is
calling him Diesel.
Yeah, something like that.
Black and white, absolutely.
Yeah, the Blood and Guts classic movie. Like, I'm a bit surprised that Dorian never snapped at his training partner in those videos, based on how.
I think Dorian loved it. I think it fed him. I think he loved being in the dungeon. There's an element of masochism in all of us bodybuilders. So
yeah, exactly. Talking about training volume, does there seem to be a minimum amount of volume you need to perform to see sufficient gain in muscle mass?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because as of late, there's been kind of this debate of like intensity versus volume, and that always makes me cock my eyebrow a little bit because I think like one is defining the amount of how much you're doing of the other. So you can't really put them on opposing ends of a debate, in my opinion, because you can reach maximal tension. You could do a maximal voluntary isometric contraction for every muscle group, for 5 seconds, right? And that would probably not induce hypertrophy except in maybe the most detrained individual or sedentary person, right? So there does need to be a certain amount of tension supplied to produce hypertrophy. And hypertrophy is kind of this side effect adaptation to doing adequate work at an adequate effort level. So both of those are needed. So in terms of the intensity, really the thing that's the most important is how hard the set is. You can get hypertrophy at low and high loads, so long as there is a sufficient total aggregate amount of that tension or volume. So there does seem to be some level of volume, but it's actually quite low. Like if you take an untrained person and just have them do, say, one set somewhere between the 6 to 20 rep range that is difficult, somewhere around, say, a 7 RPE or higher, I think you'd see robust hypertrophy adaptations. And we see that in the literature. While there is a somewhat of a dose response curve to doing more volume and getting more hypertrophy to a point, when you look at the lowest volume conditions, especially in untrained individuals, you see a big jump in gains just from doing one set programs. And that can account for sometimes more than 50% of the gains that you might see in a study. Not always, but sometimes. So there is a requirement for volume to get sufficient adaptations, but the definition of sufficient is going to be related to the individual's goals. So for example, if I have someone who comes to me who is can only get to the gym for 1 or 2 hours per week, and they're going to struggle with adherence if they're asked to do something that is quote unquote optimal to get body composition change, even though their goal is body composition change, I'm going to give them something that I think they're most likely to stick to. So I might give them a circuit of doing one set on machines or whatever exercises they like that they can perform safely for each muscle group, failing somewhere between the 6 to 20 rep range, just because I know that'll get the most bang for their buck for the time they can spend in the gym. So when I'm talking to someone who is a general pop, who's going to be in the gym for an hour and a half total per week, I give a very different message to someone who might be a drug-free competitive bodybuilder who's trying to get their pro carb, has already been lifting for nearly a decade. The latter is someone who is willing to get diminishing returns, is willing to do more work to get a smaller gain on that investment, even though it's inefficient, because that's what athletes do. They put forth a fair amount of effort, even to get a small 1% improvement, because they're competing. So I think it all needs to be put into context.
Excellent. Now, when we're talking about volume as well, there seems to be some misunderstanding regarding training frequency. Could you explain a bit how you can actually use training frequency as a tool in regards to like the amount of volume you're performing?
Yeah, so if we kind of shift our conversation more towards that competitive bodybuilder or strength athlete or someone who's interested in getting maximal hypertrophy, then we have to start looking at, okay, well, what optimizes that response? And the most recent meta-analysis we have says, 10 plus sets. And we have some emerging data that we might end up talking about where we can see that the level is higher than that. And depending on the study and the training age that you're looking at, we might be asking someone to do, 10 to 20 sets per muscle group. And if you were to try to do that with a 1 day per week split, traditional kind of bodybuilding approach, trying to do 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per session, if you split everything up that way, can be pretty difficult for certain muscle groups. Like trying to do a 20 set leg workout is tough. And it may make a lot more sense to come in twice per week and do 10 sets to maintain that quality of work. And indeed, there is also a research and a meta-analysis that's semi-recent showing that somewhere around 2 to 3 times per week of training with equated volume outperforms 1 time per week. And that doesn't surprise me because you end up doing these marathon sessions if you try to hit your volume targets in single sessions per week. So hitting it in an upper-lower approach versus a body part split, or an upper-lower full body if you want to get a higher frequency. There's a lot of ways to do it. But I would say that for most cases, to reach the volume targets that we think are appropriate, at least to start and then go from there, training once per week is probably just a little too infrequent to optimize that if that is your goal. It's not a huge issue. I would say that effort of training and volume is going to have a greater effect on hypertrophy than how you divide that. But it's essentially about making the stress imposed more efficient and trying to get a better balance between stress and recovery. And on the other hand, some movements don't serve well as high frequency options. Like you wouldn't want to do high frequency compound barbell movements that put a lot of strain on your lower back because it's not just your muscles that are getting trained, but also your connective tissues. And it may be that the frequency in and of itself with a certain load is going to cause you problems. So I think you have to also be savvy and creative and think about what movements you're choosing. But on the whole, probably training muscle groups once per week would not be the smartest way to go if your goal was to optimize hypertrophy through using higher volumes.
Excellent. So basically you're getting more quality sets by dividing the volume over more frequent training sessions. But regarding like the training once a week, like you get the impression that a lot of people think that, well, if you train your muscle groups once a week, you're not going to see any gains. But if you train them 3 times a week or 4 or 5 or 6 times a week, that's when you really start to see some gains. So I think there's some misunderstanding where people emphasize a bit too much on the training frequency and forget that it's basically just a tool you use to divide. But like you said, once a week is probably too infrequent, and based on the literature that we have now, it does seem that 2 and 3 times a week outworks 1 time a week, but you still see some gains with an infrequent training frequency like doing only once a week.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we might be failing at as science communicators in trying to get across the non-black and white nature of science. how it is all about probability and graded effect sizes, not just either it works or it doesn't. So just like doing, one set per muscle group per week can get you maybe 50% of your gains, and then getting up in the 10 to 20 range might only give you, you're literally doing a tenfold increase in volume to get 50% more gains. Like, no investment banker would suggest you do that, but if your goal is hypertrophy, that investment makes sense. Likewise, with frequency, the difference between training each muscle group once per week with high volume per session and going to 2 or 3 times per week or higher with less volume per session, it's a marginal increase, and it's not a huge one. And anyone who would like to read about this, I would check out 2 open access meta-analyses that Greg Nuckols have done on strongerbyscience.com. He has one for both strength and hypertrophy with frequency. And there is indeed an effect independent of volume, of just increasing frequency, but it's not a huge one, but certainly something that a powerlifter or a bodybuilder might consider if they are indeed plateaued, and looking for a way to kind of improve the efficiency of their training. But it needs to be thought of with a lot of context. It can't be black or white. You wouldn't want to start, like I said, doing deadlifts or squats every day. Most people who increase their frequency inadvertently increase their volume, and that's not necessarily what the literature supports. It says, hey, if you're doing a high volume, do less volume per session, split it up better so that recovery is optimized. You're getting an 8-hour sleep period between, you're getting more meals, you're getting arguably a better pattern that matches up with the way our body adapts to training, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I usually try to explain it to clients like when you're tanning. Like, you're more likely to get a nice tan if you actually do smaller sessions where you're exposing yourself to the sun compared to exposing yourself for too long and risking that you actually get sunburned.
That's a great analogy. I'm going to steal that and say that I made it up.
Steal all you want. Just use it as
You're
much
going
as you
to
want.
hear me. You're going to hear me talking to Danny Lennon, just right there with your competitor, and be like, I made this great analogy. That Danny, you can use it from now on. You just use this on Sigma. It's all about the sunburn, and it's totally original that I created.
Yeah,
and you're just going to be sitting there like, Helms! It's going to be good.
Well, I have evidence that I said it first, because on this podcast you can hear me saying that. So I might use that against you.
Touche.
Yeah, touche.
Touche.
So, yeah. All right, so talking about training volume, like you said that the dose of the amount of volume that you need when you're a beginner is fairly small, but how would you adjust that as you get more advanced?
So I'm a big proponent of not adjusting volume until you need to. And I think it's easy just to add a set. But what people forget is that they need to first assess, is my intensity of effort appropriate? Like, am I constantly training too hard? Or like, am I taking every single set to failure? Could that be the problem? Is it a recovery issue? Or is it that, I think I'm training at 8 RPE, but anyone objectively looking at me would be like, or subjectively looking at me would think that's more like a 4 or a 5. It may be that you're simply not training hard enough, or maybe your range of motion isn't very good, or that your technique is poor, or you're using momentum on a lot of movements. There's a lot of things to consider before I just start piling more volume, because if you have technique issues, if you have a poor setup, if your sleep isn't in order, or if your nutrition isn't in order, you can be making everything worse by just piling on more and more volume. So I think it's really important that although we are establishing that as you add volume, there does seem to be, to a point, a graded dose response, volume should probably be one of the last things you modify when you are plateaued. And it shouldn't be just, hey, I've been training 2 years now instead of 1. I'm going to go ahead and add 5 sets because I heard someone say intermediate should do more. It should be, am I currently making progress that I can visibly track right now? And if so, great, I'm not going to change anything. Because trust me, once you get to a certain point in your training career, any progress is something that you jump up and down about and you're excited. And the amount of work that you need to do to see marginal gains is very similar to the amount you need to see maximal gains, because maximal gains and marginal gains for a trained lifter are really close to each other. There's not a huge gap. You just don't have massive gains to unlock when you've been training progressively in the gym for years. So I think that that's a really important message that people miss sometimes. I think another important message that people miss is that the vast majority of studies on training volume, on average, last like 8 weeks. So we don't know much about long-term consequences of training with high volumes. If you were to go ahead and jack your volume up to 20 to 30 sets per week per muscle group, sure, 8 weeks, based on the studies we have, you'd probably be okay. You'd probably make some great gains. But I've frequently said that every unit of volume is a unit of risk. And every time you step foot in the gym, you're getting a lot of benefits, but there's also the risk of harm. And I have a tough time thinking that someone trying to maintain a very high volume and a high intensity of effort, which is needed to get hypertrophy, is going to make better gains than someone doing a more moderate volume in the long run, because I think the person on a very high volume program is more likely to get hurt, and that takes you out of the gym completely. So I think you can very easily have it become a tortoise versus the hare scenario. So you want to be moderate and increase volume only when necessary to make progress, and only when everything else is in place and is optimized before you just start kind of throwing more into the system.
Excellent. And that brings me to the next question, because like the last couple of years, the concept of MRV has been fairly popular amongst a lot of people in the fitness industry. Could you explain a bit more about that, and what are your opinions about MRV?
Yeah, so Dr. Mike Israetel created MRV, MEV, MAV as kind of these volume landmarks. I am not intensely familiar with them because they are logical constructs that Mike created, and I think they are helpful. So maximum recoverable volume is the idea of that the most amount of volume you can do if everything else is equal, where you are still able to recover your performance on, I think, a week-to-week basis or a mesocycle to mesocycle basis, whatever time frame you're looking at. Maximum adaptive volume. Now, if you think about that, that means you're not getting stronger. You're not seeing a performance increase. So you've done so much volume so as to overwhelm your ability to recover to the point where you can see the progressive overload, the result of the training you're doing. So that's a very high amount of volume. There's also maximum adaptive volume, which you'd think would be less, because if we think about the bell curve of response to a stimulus, there's going to be, and this is shown in the research, and I'll talk about some of the research that shows this, as you add volume, you're going to see increases in hypertrophy. Not linear, like I said, they're diminishing, but eventually you get to a point where as you add volume, you're seeing no change in the rate of hypertrophy. And then you get to a point after that where you add volume and you see a decrease in the rate of hypertrophy, but you're still growing, right? So now you're doing a level of volume that is actually harming your rate of progress, but you're still progressing. And it's not until you fall off on the very other end of the curve where you're actually doing so much volume you're not progressing, and then eventually maybe even regressing, which I think would be an insane amount of volume to do. So really we want to be on the upside of that curve. We want to be stopping before we hit that point where it's plateaued while we're adding volume. Some people would suggest that you want to be past that for overreaching, but I don't think we have solid evidence that overreaching is beneficial or necessary for hypertrophy, which is a very localized adaptive process. So, you know, and to Dr. Mike Israetel's credit, he has definitely changed his mind and thought about this, as any, I think, good rational thinker does. And you know, it was a long time ago when I got on the volume roundtable debate with him, Lane Norton, Greg Nuckols, and myself and Jeff Nippard, where we all discussed, you know, volume. And since then, he's taken a slightly different, you know, approach of saying, hey, look, you don't want to be around MRV all the time. That's not optimal. You want to maybe cycle up to that and kind of have this kind of wave loading of volume. And I think that's a very reasonable approach. It's one of many approaches. But yeah, so essentially it's just these defining terms that have been created recently. It's just a thought experiment to help people think about things. So, you know, minimum effective dose of volume, the MEV, basically the minimum amount of volume you need to do to progress, and the maximum adaptive volume, the amount of volume where you're getting the most bang for your buck, and then the maximum recoverable volume, the most volume you can do while not seeing a degradation in your performance in the gym. And I think they can be useful concepts. I am not necessarily on the same page as Mike with having them be really useful programming constructs, because I think a lot of things go into whether or not your performance has recovered acutely. So I think not that they're useless, not that they aren't something to look at, but I think in isolation or as principal core programming elements, in my mind, I don't hold them in that light, but I do think they're useful metrics. And I know, Dr. Israel would probably disagree with me there, and he has more experience using these concepts, so I could be wrong, or I could just be not giving them the credit they deserve. But that's how they sit with me in my understanding and evaluation.
Excellent. I think one of the things as well with, like, if you're that close to the amount of volume that you're able to recover from, you're more vulnerable if there's any changes in sleep or the stress in your life, or like life event that can happen. And that's something that many people might not think about. They think about, well, the stress is only the training that I'm actually doing in the gym, and then they forget that your ability to recover from training is affected by the nutrition part, the sleeping part, but also the stress management. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we really have to consider that we are not these like input-output machines of, you put in training and then out comes adaptation, and recovery is this static thing that is a direct output of how we are able to recuperate from the amount of training we're doing. All of this, while that those things are true, they all happen on this background of this complex biological system with a brain in it, right? So, we have data showing that healing slows when you're in emotional conflict. We have data showing that the more stressful life events that you report subjectively, the slower your rate of strength gains will be. We have data showing that women who have amenorrhea can correct that through counseling in some cases, which may have an indirect effect on their energy availability if they eat more or less or exercising less. But we can't forget that our subjective experience of stress in some ways is the same thing as the actual objective stress that we experience. So whether you've been in traffic, or whether you are fighting with your spouse, or whether your job is making you do some really stressful things, but it's still just 8 hours. It's just you're in conflict or anything. Like, all of these things are going to affect your outcomes in the gym, and your body composition changes. It's not so simple as just training, sleep, nutrition. It is actually much more complex than that. And that's why you have to consider things like periodization, auto-regulation, in-game calls to change your training modality. And just before anyone thinks I'm painting Mike Israel as just saying you should train your MRV all the time, he's definitely of the opinion that you should cycle up to it very briefly and then come back down to something closer to the minimum effective, volume. And he's, I think, even he would tell you, it'd be crazy to train at the most amount of volume you can possibly do all the time. You'd be, cruising for an injury, and that would, in the long run, have you burn out most likely.
Exactly. And there's actually just to mention some other data when we're talking about the issue of recovery. There's actually a cool study on cyclists where they were asked to cycle to exhaustion, and one of the group were instructed to watch a comedy for 2 hours, and the other group was asked to do a mentally taxing assignment, and then they tested. Everything else was standardized, but the guys that were told to do the mentally taxing assignment just performed way worse, maybe because they were mentally fatigued and that they didn't have the same signaling to the muscles. And there's also one other study that actually looked at, I think it was American football players, where their risk of injury or the occurrence of injuries was higher during their exam period due to higher stress levels.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a ton on that last point. There's a ton of research showing that things just go poorly in general for athletes at university when they're doing exams. So, and that's something I've seen in practice with when I'm coaching a bodybuilder or a powerlifter who's still in university. sometimes we just make sure the deloads coincide with their exam weeks, you know. So I think people do definitely have to consider just the total allostatic load, the total stress someone experiences, not just, you know, what's written down in the Excel spreadsheet.
Excellent. Now, when we're on the topic of deload, what are your usual recommendations for that? Do you prefer more of a planned approach for deloads, or more of a use them when you feel that you need them?
I think it depends on the context. And I think I'll give a preamble here first. A lot of people are just simply bad at knowing when they need them. And when left to their own devices, will run themselves into the ground. So that, I think you can definitely have a reactive approach to deloads, but you need to have some objective criteria to prevent you from getting in your own way. So in the off season, or when an athlete is in a state where they should be able to adapt to training quite well and their external stresses are low, or the stresses outside of the gym, I should say, are low, I think there's nothing wrong with a reactive approach. And this is something that I've refined more in the last couple of years and thought about. And I think there should be some kind of assessment after each mesocycle, lasting anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. After it's over, you would assess, hey, is my sleep better or worse than normal? Do I have more or less than normal, joint and connective tissue stress and pain? Do I have more or less than normal delayed onset muscle soreness? Is my overall mood and stress levels more or less than normal? And then finally, is my motivation to train more or less than normal? And then if you answer yes to 3 or more of those questions, you should probably have a deload. And if it's, 2 or less, maybe you just consider, an intro week to the next thing that's not quite as aggressive. And then if you're specifically having joint stress, maybe you just do some BFR and low load training as an intro to your next block. So you have a couple different options. And if you're feeling great, you just start the next one. And then still should be some hardline rules, like maybe you don't do any more than 3 mesocycles in a row without a deload. Because that's, we're looking at, 9 to 18 weeks of training without a down week. That's probably just better safe than sorry. You might want to take one that's easy. Now, during contest prep, especially for physique athletes, I typically have a regularly scheduled deload. So most of my clients out there are familiar with that, because for the vast majority of the time I'm working with them during contest prep. And that's just because we really need to emphasize recovery. There is a tremendous and increasing stress that comes from losing body fat, being in a diet, and all the things you have to do during contest prep to manage your life while you're slowly making yourself insane. So for that reason, I'm much more happy to err on the side of caution and have a regularly scheduled deload, every 3 to 6 weeks, with that scenario. But or after every 3 to 6 week mesocycle, I should say. But that's probably the only time I'd recommend a deload, no matter what, without some kind of adaptive schedule to it.
Excellent. Now, my personal experience is that if and I've experienced this with clients as well, that if you take it too far, and then finally when you decide to take a deload, you end up having to take a longer deload, and when you return back to training, it's almost like you're detrained in a way, like your strength levels are so much lower than when like compared to where they were. So that is also might be a thing to consider, that pushing it too far and then having to take an extended deload might also be problematic. What are your thoughts around that?
I would agree with you. And I think it comes down to, how do you think about training? A lot of people think about it theoretically. As soon as they write it down, they think, okay, this is what's going to happen. This is how it works. But in many ways, we don't know what's going on in there. Our bodies are kind of a black box for the most part, that we're getting signals and perceptions from, and then we have to figure out what that likely means. So probably a better way to think about it is as a gambler. Well, what's going to happen if I do take a deload? Well, it could, worst case scenario, slow down my progress a little bit, right? That's the worst case scenario, and I think that's actually unlikely. If I don't take a deload, what's the worst case that could happen? Like you said, I could actually incur an injury or get really burned out or get a muscle strain that requires me to be out for a month, and then, what's the best case scenario in each one? Well, if I take a deload. Best case scenario is it was perfectly timed. It was when I needed it, and I have a really good block next month, and I'm delaying any kind of, or I'm preventing potential injury. That's basically best case scenario. Okay, well, what's the best case scenario of not taking a deload? I get slightly better gains from having a week of stimulative training versus not. So if you look at it from that light, like, what do you stand to gain? What do you stand to lose? And it's pretty obvious to me that being the guy or gal who always skips deloads is a pretty bad gamble, and in the long run, that's going to hurt you.
Excellent. Now, moving up onto repetition ranges, there's been this idea that the optimal range for that you should train into to optimize muscle hypertrophy is to be in the 6 to 12 range. But there seems to be some new research that's been coming out the last couple of years. So what seems to be the most optimal range, just to give the listeners an idea of where we're standing at the moment?
The perception is that in the last few years, there's been some recent research that has proved that there may not be an actual technical hypertrophy range. But the reality is we've actually got data going back a long time, and there are something like 20 plus studies that all lead you to the same conclusion, or the vast majority of them do, is that it has to do with the total volume of training rather than the specific rep range in a given set. Now, why is it that the 6 to 12 rep range is typically associated with greater hypertrophy? Well, it's because it is kind of that midpoint of being heavy enough and providing enough intensity of effort for most people if they're in the gym with an adequate load, and it's also long enough. So it kind of is this sweet spot for where the most work is typically done, and it's just time efficient as well. Like if you're trying to do a powerlifting approach of 5x5 or 7x3 or something like that, the rest periods alone are very add a lot to your training. And then just the strain of lifting heavy loads all the time typically also limits your ability to perform multiple sessions per week at a high enough volume. And on the other end of the spectrum, when you're trying to do 30, 40 rep sets, the metabolic cost within session can lead to you're spending more time trying not to throw up in the bathroom than actually doing other sets. And the pain and the perception of global fatigue can actually make you stop a set well short of failure when locally you've actually not stimulated that muscle effectively. Now, the cool part is that in recent years, we've gotten some research that has defined the edges a little bit of where it is, like what types of sets probably don't really make sense or don't have much of a role. A recent study came out showing that even when you do similar amounts of volume or more volume, working at 20% of 1RM or lighter just simply doesn't result in an adequate hypertrophy compared to heavier loading. So you can go too light, but it's pretty damn light. We're talking like 40, 50 rep sets that probably are not ideal if we're talking about 20% of 1RM, depending on the individual. And this makes sense because now all of a sudden we're doing something a little different than resistance training. You could even be getting a very small interference effect from that or something like that. And I think the weakest link in the chain of what's going to prevent you doing 40 or 50 reps is typically not going to be something related to hypertrophy. That's not the same mechanism which is going to stop you from being able to do a set of 12. So to me, I think it's very possible that you're having global fatigue issues versus acute fatigue issues, which is more the way you stimulate muscle. So that's on the high end. So it probably makes sense to be at least around like 30 to 40% of 1RM. So we're talking like maybe 30, 35 reps at the highest for any given set. On the low end, you could certainly do singles if you wanted. You could do singles and doubles. You just have to do a lot of them. Mm-hmm. In that collective group of research that we have kind of on like 20 plus studies, there was a recent systematic review that came out where they looked at matching either volume load or just the total number of sets. And they concluded that a set anywhere in the range of, say, 6 to 20 plus, we'll just say 6 to 30, if it's to sufficient intensity of effort, like if you do a set of 6 to failure or a set of 20 to failure, for hypertrophy, not other adaptations, that's going to provide a very similar stimulus. Now, why might that be? That might be confusing for people to hear. When you do a set of 6, pretty much every single rep, you're going to be getting very close to maximal recruitment of muscle fibers. They're going to be put under a high tension, And if you do those 6 reps, they're all going to be relatively slow reps because it's heavy. That's just physics. So that means you're going to be spending a fair amount of time under a high amount of tension, and you're going to reach the point where pretty much everything has fatigued. In a set of 20, the earlier repetitions, while they're at a very low tension level, they're not hard at all. They're setting up the fatigue to make the rest of the set much more stimulative. And it's not just simply comparing metabolic fatigue to tension either. When you do a high rep set to failure, you're still actually supplying a lot of tension because there's mechanotransduction within the muscle, meaning that tension is supplied across muscle fibers. And as certain fibers fatigue and can no longer contribute, other ones have to, quote unquote, take up the slack. So they're getting a local tension stimulus, even though the absolute load is lower. And you see cycling in of high threshold motor units when you do high rep sets. So even the high threshold motor units and their associative fast twitch fibers do get trained and eventually get fatigued because you can no longer complete the set. So just from a purely hypertrophy perspective, you can use a wide variety of rep ranges, and probably the most effective way to count volume, or I should say the most intuitive and the most simple, is just the number of quote unquote hard sets that are at least 6 reps and less than, say, 30 or 35.
Excellent. Now, there seems to be a lot more focus now on people maybe using some of the sets with the higher rep ranges. But my question is always, why would you do that? Like, what is the application of actually doing that if you can get similar effect with a rep range that will probably take you not the same amount of time?
That's a great question. And I think there is a time and a place and an exercise specific drive to what rep range you should use. So on one hand, there is certainly the theoretical argument that perhaps you should use a mixture of loading ranges, maybe especially at high levels. And there isn't great evidence for this, but there is theoretical speculation that you might get a little more fast twitch or slow twitch stimulation by using either heavier end of that range or lighter. The theory being that if you're doing always 6 to 8, it's not a long enough time spent to really get a training effect on the slow twitch fibers, although you do still hit failure because they can't contribute enough to overcome the external load. And on the other end of the spectrum, you might hit failure on a set of 30, and those fast twitch muscle fibers get cycled in, but not enough to really get a continuous training effect, and it may not be enough to overcome that 21st rep, so they may not get an adequate training effect. So I think there's an argument theoretically for high-level individuals trying to get maximal hypertrophy to perhaps train through the full spectrum. I think there's even a stronger argument, though, to consider the movement. For example, doing sets of 20 reps on squats to even an adequate RPE of, like, say, 7 is going to leave you incredibly fatigued because it's a full body movement, and it's also a high-risk movement. And it puts certain joints in positions where you're likely to stress, to put some stress on connective tissues. So, and as fatigue breaks down, as form breaks down due to fatigue, I think those are risky sets to be doing. I see the rest of that leg workout really going to shit if you do 3 sets of 20 on squats. So it might make a lot more sense to do moderately low reps on those heavy compound movements, and then high reps on other movements, especially movements where people get isolated joint pain, like, for example, elbow tendonitis from curls. Doing sets of 20 on curls, you're much more likely to not have pain and to allow, those semi-soft structures to recover. And that's another reason why someone might want to use blood flow restriction training, which is, for a different podcast. But the point being is, if you can get the same stimulation from very low loads, that can actually be helpful if you have joint issues, or if you have any kind of connective tissue issue when you're training. So I think certain movements lend themselves to higher reps. Also, certain movements, they kind of make you want to cheat if you go too heavy, like rows, for example. If you use a lighter load closer to failure, you're typically able to get more quality reps without using momentum or hitching. So you're actually taking tension off the muscle. So I typically use higher reps when I do things like rows, pull downs, and isolation movements. And then I use lower reps for things like compound barbell movements, where high reps would really just wreck the rest of the session.
Excellent. You mentioned a bit about taking the sets to failure, and there seems to be different opinions. Some people say you shouldn't go to failure. Some people say you should always go to failure. But as most things when it comes to training and nutrition, there is context that you need to take into consideration. So what are your general recommendations on training to failure?
I think it's very context dependent, and I'll kind of go full circle back to whether you are someone who's going to be in the gym for an hour or 2 hours per week, like your kind of typical person who is trying to get into shape or adopt a fitness lifestyle. And when you're only going to be in the gym for an hour or 2 hours per week, doing something like one set per muscle group to failure is a great way to make the most of the time that you can spend in there, because you're simply not going to be in there long enough to do 20 sets per muscle group. So I would give a very different message to someone like that. However, the bodybuilder who is trying to recover and drive higher training volumes and use higher training frequencies to organize all that has to think about the fatigue caused by failure, both intra-session and inter-session. So we have a lot of good data now showing that for the goal of strength and hypertrophy, there doesn't seem to be an advantage of going to failure so long as you are sufficiently close to it. Now, the real question is how close is sufficiently close? And we don't have a good answer for that yet. This is just one study, but the primary study I did for my PhD, we had two groups. One used a percentage 1RM based on their pre-test 1RM for both squat and bench press. And then the other group, while they did a pre-test 1RM, they used an RPE range throughout the study that went from all the way from 5 to 7 at the start to 8 to 10 at the finish. So on average, the RPE in the RPE group was like between 7 and 9, while the RPE in the percentage 1RM group that was always using their pre-test 1RM was down around 5 or 6. And these were trained individuals, well-trained individuals. I think when they went into the study, they could all squat more than 1.5 times body weight, and their squat average was in the low 300s. And by the end of the study, we didn't see any significant difference in muscle thickness in either the pec or the quadricep, despite the fact that one group was training at a 5 to 6 RPE the whole time. So I don't know where that threshold quite is. And it also depends on how you set up your training. So we have good data now showing that if you take 3 sets of 10 to failure, you will have an additional day or so of recovery before you're back to baseline with your ability to perform, compared to doing 5 sets of 6 at a 5 RPE. Now, if you take those two studies and compare them, and if we think, oh, well, 7 to 9 RPE seem to produce at least a non-significantly different amount of hypertrophy to a 7 to 9 RPE, however, the same amount of volume is more fatiguing when you go to failure, it makes you think, okay, well, we don't want to go to failure all the time if our goal is to do a reasonably high volume. We need to control it in some manner. So typically the practical recommendations I give based on those data points is that you probably want to take your more full body-esque compound movements, like your big pushes, your big pulls, your hip hinges and your squats and your lunges and things like that, somewhere between, say, a 6 to 9 RPE, depending on your phase of training. You may be only taking that last set closer to that 9 and the earlier sets closer to 6, 7, or 8. And then when you move into isolation movements or compound movements that are a little easier, like a lat pull down or something like that, that's when you can feel free to push closer to failure, but probably save it until the last set for each muscle group. You know, if you think about it, if you've got lat pull downs and rows to do, and let's say the rows are like a pendulum row, that's pretty full body. You keep that around, a 6 to 8 RPE. Then when you get the lat pull down, you can start in the 8 RPE and let that third set climb up to a 9, 9.5, or 10. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And then when you get to single joint isolation movements, you can push pretty close to failure just because the cost is going to be a lot less in terms of recovery and how it's going to affect your training the next day or even the next 2 days.
Excellent. And would you also say that it depends where you are in your training cycles? So maybe taking more of the sets closer to failure if you're at the end of your cycle and you're going to do a deload after that?
Yeah, totally. I think it depends on your strategy for inducing progressive overload, right?
Hmm.
So you may be someone who is taking that more Mike Israetel approach, where you're just adding sets week to week to week, and you may just find that even without necessarily changing the load on the bar very much, you are getting a little closer to failure simply because you're doing more sets and there's cumulative fatigue.
Hmm.
Or you could take a more linear approach, kind of like I outline in my training books for like an intermediate, where you drop the reps down each week, but you increase load. Depending on how much you're increasing load, you will probably see a steady climb in RPE. And then you might add volume in a mesocycle later if you didn't progress. But typically, you are going to see RPEs climb as you get closer and closer to the end of a mesocycle or the next deload. So I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Also, for power lifters, you're typically going to see a decrease in volume, but an increase in RPE as they're getting more and more specific to the goal of lifting as heavy as they possibly can on the platform. So, for example, if you were to take a big step back and look at someone's build up to a couple of different competitions, you might see their earlier phases characterized by training, say 5 to 10 reps in most of their movements, and a 5 to 8 RPE, and then in the very end they're training 5 reps or less in 8.5 to 10 RPE, to be very specific to the goal of getting on the platform and expressing maximal strength. So definitely it does depend on where you're at in your training relative to your goal.
Excellent. Now, you touched a bit about using more programmed or planned deloads when you're when you're cutting compared to when you're off season. What about adjusting the rep ranges and the total volume? Do you do any changes there, like compared to the off season during a caloric restriction phase?
Yeah, absolutely. I think volume is stressful, and there's good data to show, like we talked about, in someone who is not dieting, a small amount of volume doesn't mean no gains or a regression of progress. It just means less quick progress, Now, certainly at a high level, if you were to drop down from, say, 10 to 20 sets and you found that's what you actually needed to progress down to like 5 sets, I think you would actually see some minor regression and it would take some time. So I'm not talking about like a 2/3 reduction in volume, but sometimes I will definitely reduce volume based on how stressed my competitor seems while I'm coaching them, how beat up they're feeling, and how their strength may or may not be progressing. And I typically pick on exercises that are the most stressful. So you'll see me pulling from things like RDL or squats first, just dropping a set here and there. What it typically amounts to is that let's say we have a 24-week prep, which is a non-uncommon length of prep in modern day times for, say, someone competing in bodybuilding. The first 8 to 10 weeks, there might be no change at all. They're probably dropping down from high teens in terms of body fat percentage down closer to 11 or 10% body fat in that period. And that's typically they start feeling better. They feel more lively. They've still got plenty of food. They're not doing a ton of cardio. So their joints aren't being very beat up. And they may even see just an improvement in fitness, and they're recovering better initially. But right around the end of that period, they're starting to feel a little more beat up. The stress of dieting and kind of that continual focus gets to them, and there's actually physical effects as well. And that's when I start picking on volume a little bit, and we might see maybe 90 or 80% of their off-season volume happening right around that midpoint in prep on average. And that's something I don't just do automatically. I do, based on what's happening. And then towards the very end of prep, you can definitely see that there may be a substantial reduction in volume to where they're doing, 3/4 or 2/3 of what they might have done in the off season, just because we're trying to do what they can versus try to do as much as they can.
Excellent. So the next question that I have, there's been a recent study by Schoenfeld and colleagues that looked at the dose response of volume on muscle hypertrophy. And I know that this is a study that's gotten a lot of attention. So could you first describe what they actually found in the study?
Yeah, for sure. So this is a study led by Schoenfeld with Krieger, Contreras, Gurgic, and a few others. And my apologies to any of their authors. I can't just remember it off the top of my head, but I appreciate your work. And they had well-trained men. So I think they were on average, or at least at a minimum, I think when you look at the group, having 4 years of training experience or more. and they trained essentially a full body bodybuilding type split 3 days per week. In one group, they did 1 set per exercise. One group did 3 sets per exercise, and the final group did 5 sets per exercise. So on the very low end, they're finishing these sessions in like 13 minutes with only 1 set per exercise. I think they're resting between, I think around 90 seconds to 2 minutes, if I recall correctly. 90 seconds between sets, I think 2 minutes between exercises. And on the high end, they're taking over an hour because they have to go through, a full body exercise with 5 sets per movement. Now, for the most part, they found that performance was not that related to volume in terms of strength. There were similar adaptations in all the groups, which is interesting. And it more or less lines up with a meta-analysis by Ralston and colleagues that came out that showed, kind of anywhere in that 5 to 12 set range per movement is going to produce a similar strength response. And I think, for one, we have to put it into context. They were using hypertrophy rep ranges in this study by Schoenfeld. So it's not the same as doing like sets of 5. I think there might be maybe a stronger relationship with volume or number of sets when they're more specific. But there's a huge motor learning concept, or rather I should say contributor to strength. It's not just how big your muscles are. And on that note, where they did see a relationship between strength per se, or performance I should say, with hypertrophy, was in isolated muscle group performance. So for example, like leg extensions. And this isn't in the full text. This is something you can read about on James Krieger's blog. They saw that there was a significant correlation between the ability to perform like total volume load over multiple sets of an isolated muscle group. So for example, quadriceps hypertrophy was related to the number of total reps at a given load you could get over multiple sets. And that makes a lot more sense. There's less of a skill component, and that's where you'd think that hypertrophy would play a bigger role in the expression of strength. So more or less, they found that strength was not dependent on volume, and that even with just 13 minutes a day in the gym 3 times per week, you can get robust strength adaptations. So very cautionary tale here of saying, hey, don't just do all the volume if your primary goal are fitness outcomes like muscular endurance or strength. And they put that right there in the abstract in the conclusion, which I thought was really cool of them to do. But they did note that hypertrophy seemed to have a dose response with volume. Now, when I say dose response, I don't mean a linear dose response. I mean that same diminishing returns. The biggest differences were between the 1 set and the 5 set group, and the smallest differences were between the 5 and the 3 set group. So we're starting to see the curve of that parabola as they get up into kind of the 27 to 45 sets per muscle group, which is an insanely high amount of volume. Just to put that in perspective, I don't think people should be prescribing 30 to 45 sets per muscle group based off this study. And I don't think the authors think you should do that either. A few things to consider is that they were doing compound movements. So when they count their sets based off previous meta-analytic criteria, a row and a bicep curl both count as a set of bicep volume. That's probably not the way it works in the real world. So I wouldn't have someone who wants to grow their arms do like 45 sets of curls per week. That's a great recipe for elbow tendonitis. Mm-hmm. So essentially what they found over this 8-week period was that there was a trend towards being bigger the more volume you did in each one of these categories, kind of in that, I believe, 6 to 9 sets, and then kind of that mid-range, kind of 12 to 15-ish. And then in the highest, and I could be misrepresenting these ranges a little bit, but the highest was between, I think, 27 to 45 sets per muscle group. And that is surprising. It does contradict some of the other findings in some ways in similar dose response studies. So most significantly, what people are probably familiar with is the German volume training studies that came out not too long ago. There's 2 of them where they had 2 groups either doing 10 by 10 on movements or 5 by 10. A couple times per week, and they found that the 5 by 10 groups in both of these studies made more gains, greater hypertrophy, and I think greater strength gains on the whole compared to the 10 by 10 group. So this is actually showing that in these studies, the German volume training studies that came out not too long ago, that parabola curve where I talked about where you fall off the other side and you can actually not make progress because you're doing too much and can't recover, occurs closer to something like 15 sets per muscle group. While doing 30 sets per muscle group actually resulted in like no visible progress over the study in terms of hypertrophy. So I think the big question is, well, what's going on here? Why is it that the German volume training studies and some others didn't find the same thresholds as the study that Schoenfeld just published? And I personally think that the big difference is the training age of the participants. When you've got individuals who've been in the gym training to maximize hypertrophy for 4+ years, I think you're going to see a much greater resilience, due to the repeated bout effect, experience with movements, and the need to just push higher volumes and workloads, and the work capacity that's been built to do so, to keep progressing, is going to shift that curve to the right a lot. However, the average person who was in the German volume training studies, like their average bench press was 1 times body weight or just under it. And most people, males at least, when they've been in the gym for even any substantial amount of time training seriously, they'll be able to bench their body weight after not too long. So I think we're looking at basically novices in the German volume training studies, trained but still novice, compared to what we probably call actually well-trained people, even in colloquial terms. So that's the difference. And I think this is not a message saying that, hey, if you've been a serious hardcore trainer for a while and you're not progressing, you need to do 30 to 45 sets per muscle group. I think that's actually a really bad idea. We only have 8 weeks of data on that. And this is just one study. It's not a meta-analysis. I think the message might be, if you are plateaued and if everything else is in order, like we talked about earlier, you might want to consider an increase in volume. However, if you're going to try to get outside of like 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, you're going to have to get very savvy and very creative. You're going to have to be very picky with which exercises you use. You're going to think about increasing your frequency so that no session becomes crazy. You might be in the gym 5 to 6 days per week just to keep the sessions manageable. And you probably want to do something like a muscle group specialization split. Since we know you can maintain your hypertrophy with much lower volumes than that, maybe it looks like something of doing, say, 8 to 12 sets per muscle group on the muscle groups that you're just trying to maintain, and then pushing past that 20 set range on 1 or 2 muscle groups for a period of a mesocycle or 2. And I think if you tried to take the program that was done in Schoenfeld, where you're doing 27 to 45 sets per muscle group on all muscle groups for longer than 8 weeks or substantially longer, I think that would end up poorly for most people. So I think while the study is really useful in that it shows us how the body adapts and helps us understand that theory, and I think it pushes forward the idea that training age does dictate appropriate levels of volume to some degree, I think it also shouldn't be just taken directly to practice. It's a conceptual study, in my opinion, rather than a study that tells us what to do in the gym.
Excellent, Eric. Excellent. Final question. Give us a take-home message to wrap up this podcast.
Quality over quantity is my take-home message. Any fool can just do a ton of volume and hope that it works. But if you are not feeling the target muscles training, if you're not seeing increases in training load, or if you're making volume increases when you're still making strength progress, if you're increasing volume out of impatience, or this grass is greener mentality, or when your nutrition and sleep aren't in order, you're probably going to get more harm than benefit. And I would really advise everyone to make sure their ship is in order before they start adding more sails and oars to it. Excellent.
Once again, Eric, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Finally, is there anywhere where people can find more information about you?
Absolutely. Check us out at 3dmusclejourney.com. That's the letter D following the number 3. And from there, you can get links to MASS, our research review. You can get links to my books. You can get links to our podcast, our YouTube channel, the whole 9 yards. And for those who want to see old school pre-steroid era lifters, me lifting weights, occasional silly memes, and random links to studies and articles that are evidence-based, you can follow me on Instagram at Helms3DMJ.
Excellent. I highly recommend people following Eric on Instagram, especially his series on actually showing what's possible to accomplish when it comes to muscle mass by being natural. There's some pretty freakish physiques from an era where even anabolic steroids weren't available. So I really find the series you've done on that really interesting, and I think a lot of other people do as well.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Thank you. All right, Eric, thank you so much again for your time. This was an awesome podcast, and it was really nice to get you back on. I will have to start and bring you more often on the podcast to talk about other topics. So hopefully you will accept my invitations.
Man, I want to go 4 times, bro. I want to get that 4th and 5th. I want to do another acceptance speech. This is going to go on my CV. I'm putting on my CV.
Perfect.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eric, and have a nice day.
You too.
Thank you.